Okay, chapter 10 is causal comparative research. This type of research design is intended to determine the cause of existing differences. So the key for causal comparative, one of the key concepts for causal comparative research is that it's ex post facto, or after the fact. We are looking at existing differences. So we're not trying to manipulate the independent variable like we would in an experimental study. We're not changing anything. We're just stepping back and seeing what's going on. There are existing differences. We're studying what's going on after they've happened, after the fact. And there's actually two different types of causal comparative studies. One is retrospective, the other is prospective. So if we go back here to this question, what factors predict success in graduate school? You could do a prediction study, right, or a correlational study to see what are the relationships between graduate school success and other variables. So you could do that, but you could also do a causal comparative research study to answer this question. What factors predict success in graduate school? If you wanted to do a retrospective causal comparative study, you would look retrospectively, meaning you would look at the outcome first, or the effect first, which in this case is success in graduate school, and you would go back retrospectively to see if another factor contributed to that effect. So I might hypothesize that undergraduate GPA might be a predictor for success in graduate school. So if I did a retrospective causal comparative study, I would look at success in graduate school. Let's say those who graduate with a 3.5 GPA or above, right? And my predictor variable is undergraduate GPA. So then I would break you guys into two groups, those with high undergrad GPA and those with low undergrad GPA. And I would see the relationship there. It's retrospective because I'm starting with the outcome first and then going back and asking, hey, by the way, what was your undergrad GPA? It's already happened, right? Your undergrad GPA has already happened. Prospective causal comparative studies look at it from the other way around. So you're looking at undergrad GPA first. So I would ask you first, hey, what was your undergrad GPA? I would break you guys up into two groups, and I would track you guys in those two groups how you do by the time you graduate. So it's prospective because I'm looking ahead, right? I'm starting from the independent variable, the undergrad GPA, and I'm seeing what happens afterward. So it's perspective. I think students get confused sometimes about the differences between these different types of studies. So cause and effect relationships. Correlational studies cannot determine cause and effect, right? All we're saying for correlational studies is that there is a correlation or relationship between two or more variables. Experimental studies can determine cause and effect, right? That's the whole point of experimental studies, is that we can manipulate variables to see if this causes this. Similar thing with causal comparative. We're trying to see if this predicts this or this causes another variable. And so that leads to variable manipulation. Experimental studies do manipulate variables. So say you have one group who gets a social skills intervention and another group who does not. We're manipulating that variable, which is the social skills intervention. We don't manipulate variables for correlational studies or causal comparative studies. And another difference between these different types of studies is whether we're studying differences or similarities between groups or among variables. And this is particularly for causal comparative studies. We're looking at differences and similarities between groups, because in causal comparative, we're breaking up, like we're actually creating two groups of participants. And we're looking to see if there's a difference or similarity between those two groups. I'm interested in students who have high undergrad GPA versus students who have low undergrad GPA. I'm interested in those two groups and whether they're similar or different in other variables. With correlational studies, I'm interested in differences and similarities among variables. So one variable might be undergraduate GPA, and another variable could be graduate school GPA. Those are different variables. In correlational studies, I want to know the differences and similarities between those variables, undergrad GPA and graduate GPA. Okay. And the final important point here is that ethics. So ethically, okay, so there may be some studies that you could do. Technically, you could do it, but it would be unethical to do, right? So there may be some experimental studies where you're like, yeah, I could do that technically, but I wouldn't want to do it because it's a terrible study. So then you might try to do a causal comparative study. So for example, say you're interested in the effects of corporal punishment on people's psychosocial adjustment. An experimental study could be that you create two groups and you tell one group of parents to use corporal punishment on their children, and you tell another group of parents to not use corporal punishment on their children. And we're going to see what happens, right? You could do that, but that would be very unethical. So then you could do, as an alternative, a causal comparative study. So you ask adult children or adolescents, and you ask them, did your parents use corporal punishment on you? And the kids will say either yes or no. Now you've got two groups. And with those two groups, you can evaluate their level of psychosocial functioning. You didn't have to manipulate any variable, right? So that's an example of how, like, sometimes you might think, well, I can't do an experimental study, so I can do a causal comparative study. All right, with that said, there are some limitations and cautions for causal comparative studies. One is that there's limited control over the study, right? Experimental studies are good because you actually can control and manipulate variables, but we can't do that with causal comparative studies. And so we have to be cautious about the interpretations. And I think it was the very first slide or the second slide of this video that talked about, and the textbook says too, like causal comparative studies is intended to examine or predict this causing this, or like what causes what. But we can't actually technically answer that question because it gets into the question of which came first. So if I'm interested in, let's say, corporal punishment and psychosocial adjustment, I might say, well, corporal punishment predicts psychosocial well-being. But maybe not, maybe it's the other way around. Maybe kids who have poor psychosocial functioning are more likely to frustrate their parents, and the parents inflict corporal punishment, right? Maybe, we don't know. That's the problem with causal comparative studies, is that we actually don't know which came first because we are studying ex post facto, right? After the fact. So if something's already happened, we can't say this predicts this. Okay, and another limitation is that we have to be cautious with interpretation because there might be other variables affecting a particular relationship. Example, this is actually my dissertation study, and so I was looking at the relationship, and this has already been established in prior studies, is that there's a relationship between motivation and achievement. Kids who are highly motivated to succeed in school tend to succeed in school. Makes sense. But what I proposed for my dissertation is that there's probably something else going on, right? Because kids who are really, really, really motivated, they are super motivated. Just being motivated doesn't lead to good grades, right? There has to be something that happens, right? Kids have to be really motivated, and they have to actually put the effort in, and the effort leads to achievement, right? So that was what I proposed, that there is maybe another variable here that's affecting the relationship between motivation and achievement. So kids who are super motivated, they go to school, they're listening to the teacher, they're doing their homework, and they're engaged in school. And that engagement leads to their academic achievement. So in this case, if I were just looking at motivation and achievement, we might find, yeah, motivation and achievement are related, but there might be other variables. So with that in mind, we have to think about how we might address that limitation. So, but before we get there, I want to explain a little bit about the process. So what happens? How do I do causal comparative research? You might want to do that do this type of study for your proposal. So the first thing you do is you create two comparison groups, and you're looking to see if there's a significant difference or differences on a dependent variable. So the two groups could be the presence or absence of something. So your two groups might be kids who have a piano at home, and the other group is kids who don't have a piano at home. Or they can be two groups depending on the degree. So kids who come from low SES backgrounds versus kids who come from high SES backgrounds. So you have those two groups, and you have to carefully select the groups. You have to operationalize your variables or define your variables. If you're interested in creating two groups, one with high achievement and one with low achievement, you have to create a rule that says you go into this group, you go into this group. Okay, so you have to operationalize those variables, and you should randomly select if possible. And sometimes it's not possible or very difficult, but random selection is always better, right, to increase representativeness. If you think about high achievement versus low achievement, you're a school psych, you're working in a school district, and you want to create those two groups, and you think, oh, well, this campus has a lot of high achieving students, and this school has a lot of low achieving students. So there we go, I've got my two groups. I'm going to pull the high achieving group students from this school, and the low achieving students from this school. So you've got two groups, right? Sure, but random selection would be better because your interpretations are limited, right? Because there might be other variables that are associated with this school versus this school that are going to muddle your effects. So what would be better is if you get some high achieving students from this school and some low achieving students from this school and high achieving students from this school and low achieving students from this school, right? And you randomly select them if that's possible. Okay. And so this goes back to the limitations of causal comparative research, is that there's no manipulation, randomization can be difficult, and it's difficult to control other variables. Those are all limitations of causal comparative research. And we acknowledge that, but there are different ways to try to address that. So here's an example. Let's say one of your groups for the Ethics, Law, and Professional Issues class did a poster and paper on disproportionality, right? And so you might be interested in race, ethnicity, and achievement test scores. So you're going to create different groups of race and ethnicity and look at the differences between the groups in achievement test scores. So, and that actually has been established. We know that there's a relationship there. But what about other variables that might be contributing to this relationship, like socioeconomic status, or the school that they attend, the characteristics of the schools, the zip code of residence, so that gets into different neighborhoods, right? And those variables might actually be contributing to achievement test scores. If you only looked at race, ethnicity, and achievement test scores, we don't know, right, what other factors are contributing to this relationship. So we need to control for these variables. And there's different ways to do that. One is by matching, in the orange here. So we're matching, this is just an example. I just want to simplify and say we're only interested in the differences between white kids and black kids. So with matching, I'm going to match this group of white students and this group of black students. So I'm going to match them on the control variable, the variable that I want to control. And so in this example is SES. So to match, I want to make sure that I have an equal number of kids with low SES, medium SES, and high SES in each group. If I match it, then I can control for that variable because that variable is equal. Then the results that I get will be based on whether or not the kids are white or black. And I can look at those differences on their achievement test scores. So that's matching. Homogeneous groups is the example in the blue here. With homogeneous groups, I just want these groups to be the same in the control variable, in the variable that I want to control. So I'm just going to pick kids with low SES, 150 white kids who come from low SES backgrounds and 150 black kids with low SES backgrounds. Kind of similar to matching, but homogeneous groups say mean that the groups are the same, essentially, on this particular level of control variable. So it doesn't have to be low SES. Maybe I just take 150 high SES kids, right? And I break them up by these are the white kids and these are the black kids. Or I might do homogeneous subgroups, which is a little bit more complex, but a similar idea from homogeneous groups. Here we have 50 white kids who come from low SES backgrounds, 50 black kids who come from low SES backgrounds. And same for high SES and white kids and black kids with high SES. Okay? And with homogeneous subgroups, I have multiple groups, so I can do a factorial ANOVA to see if there's differences between any of these groups. So I might say, well, I want to know if there's a difference between this group and this group. And I want to know if there's a difference between this group and this group. I can also look at the difference between this group and this group. And same here, this group and this group. That's homogeneous subgroups. So there's different ways, and each of these ways we can control for SES. Okay? So if you're going to do a causal comparative research, you do want to think about control procedures, especially when you're looking at variables where past research has shown that there are other variables that contribute to that relationship. Okay. Interpretation and analysis. The first thing you want to look at for this type of research is descriptive statistics, means and standard deviations. And there's different types, right? You can run t-tests, you can do ANOVA analyses, and chi-square analyses. All of these different tests are basically causal comparative research. We're comparing differences between groups. So we might find that kids who come, like white kids, have an achievement score of 100 and black kids have an achievement score of 100. Like their means are the same. So you look at descriptive statistics, and these different types of inferential statistics help us identify whether the differences among and between the groups are statistically significant. Okay, so if the white kids get scores of 100 and the black kids get scores of 101, and those are the means, that's probably not statistically significant, right? And so, but 100 versus 200, that might be statistically significant. So these inferential statistical tests help tell us whether those differences are statistically significant. Okay. Oh, and that's it. So that was Chapter 10, Causal Comparative Research.